A reclusive rancher in rural Montana notices his young housekeeper limping and discovers she's hiding a dark secret involving domestic abuse. What starts as a simple act of kindness spirals into a dangerous confrontation with her violent boyfriend, forcing the quiet rancher to make choices that will change both their lives forever. When the sheriff arrives, he's shocked to discover the lengths the rancher went to protect someone he barely knew. The coffee cup slipped from Maria's hand the moment she thought I wasn't watching. I saw it happen from the kitchen window, the ceramic shattering against the hardwood floor, her face twisting in pain as she bent to collect the pieces. But it wasn't the broken cup that caught my attention. It was the way she favored her left leg, the careful, practiced movement of someone trying to hide an injury. I'm not the kind of man who involves himself in other people's business. Never have been. 43 years old, living alone on 800 acres of Montana wilderness, and that's exactly how I prefer it. When my wife Sarah died 3 years ago, I figured I'd spend whatever time I had left in the quiet company of my cattle and the endless sky above the ranch. People complicate things. People bring drama, expectations, emotions I'm not equipped to handle anymore. That's why hiring Maria 6 months ago felt like such a risk. But the house had become a monument to neglect. Dishes piling up, dust coating every surface, Sarah's things still scattered exactly where she'd left them. I needed help, but I needed it from someone who understood the value of silence. Maria Gonzalez was 24, spoke broken English with a soft accent that reminded me of summer rain, and most importantly, she worked like a ghost through my house. 3 times a week, she'd arrive at dawn in her beat-up Honda Civic, clean for 6 hours without saying more than good morning and see you Wednesday, then disappear back to whatever life she led in town. Perfect arrangement. No complications. But watching her wince as she gathered those broken pieces, something twisted in my chest, a feeling I thought I'd buried alongside Sarah. The way Maria moved told a story I didn't want to read, painted in the careful choreography of someone who'd learned to hide pain as a survival skill. I waited until she'd swept up the ceramic and started loading the dishwasher before walking into the kitchen. She tensed the moment she heard my boots on the floor, her shoulders drawing up like a startled animal. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my voice low and even. Direct questions had always been my way. No dancing around subjects, no wasted words. Yes, Mr. Thompson, just clumsy today. She didn't look at me, focusing instead on arranging plates with unnecessary precision. I studied her profile. Maria was a small woman, maybe 5'4", with dark hair she always kept pulled back in a practical ponytail. She had the kind of quiet prettiness that didn't demand attention, brown eyes, olive skin that spoke of heritage, and hands that worked with the efficiency of someone who'd been taking care of others her whole life. But today, something was different. Her usual grace had been replaced by a stiffness that set my teeth on edge. "That limp's getting worse," I said. Her hands stopped moving. For a long moment, the only sound was the old refrigerator humming in the corner and the distant lowing of cattle in the east pasture. "Old injury," she said finally. "Acts up when it rains." It hadn't rained in 2 weeks. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, considering my next words carefully. In my experience, pushing too hard too fast was the surest way to shut down a conversation before it started. But something about the careful way she was breathing, the tremor in her hands as she reached for the next plate, told me this wasn't about some old injury. "Maria." She looked up at me then, and I saw something that made my jaw clench. Fear, bright and immediate, flashing across her features before she could hide it. "If someone's hurting you, you can tell me." The plate she was holding slipped from her fingers. This time I was close enough to catch it. "No one is hurting me," she said, but her voice came out too high, too quick. I fell. Yesterday, down my apartment stairs." I set the plate on the counter and really looked at her. Now that I was paying attention, I could see the other signs I'd been too wrapped up in my own isolation to notice before. The way she turned her head to hide the left side of her face, the long sleeves she wore even on warm days, the way she moved through my house like she was afraid of taking up too much space. "Fell down the stairs," I repeated. She nodded but wouldn't meet my eyes. I've been around enough injured animals to recognize the signs of trauma. A horse that's been beaten will flinch at sudden movements for months afterward. A dog that's been kicked will cower at the sound of raised voices. And a woman who's being hurt will learn to make herself invisible, to move through the world like an apology. The coffee in my cup had gone cold, but I took a sip anyway, buying myself time to think. Part of me, the larger part if I'm being honest, wanted to accept her explanation and go back to our comfortable arrangement of mutual silence. It would be easier, safer. But Sarah's voice echoed in my memory, something she'd said to me years ago after we'd watched our neighbor ignore obvious signs that his wife was in trouble. The worst evil in this world happens when good people decide it's not their problem. I set my cup down with more force than necessary. "Maria, I want you to listen to me carefully," I said. "I don't know what's happening in your life outside this ranch, and I won't pretend to understand your situation, but I want you to know that this place, my home, it's safe. You understand? Whatever's going on, whoever might be causing you trouble, they're not welcome here." She stared at me for a long moment, her dark eyes searching my face for something. Maybe sincerity, maybe a trap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't understand, Mr. Thompson. Some things, at some people, they don't just go away because you tell them to." The weight of those words settled between us like a challenge. If you've ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between staying safe and doing what's right, tell me from which part of the world you're listening to this story. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we never planned to fight. The next morning, Maria didn't show up. I found myself checking the kitchen window every few minutes, watching for her beat-up Honda to come rattling down the gravel drive. By 10 o'clock, I was pacing. By noon, I was worried sick. This wasn't like her. In 6 months, Maria had never missed a day without calling first. She was the most reliable person I'd ever hired, more dependable than half the ranch hands I'd worked with over the years. Something was wrong. I tried to convince myself she was just sick, maybe dealing with that old injury she'd mentioned. But the memory of the fear in her eyes yesterday wouldn't leave me alone. The way she'd said some people don't just go away because you tell them to kept echoing in my head like a warning bell. By 2 o'clock, I couldn't stand it anymore. I'd never been to Maria's apartment, but I knew she lived in the Riverside complex on the edge of town, a rundown collection of 2-story buildings that housed most of the service workers who couldn't afford anything better. The drive into town took 20 minutes through winding mountain roads, giving me plenty of time to second-guess myself. What was I doing? Maria was a grown woman who could take care of herself. Maybe she'd quit. Maybe she'd decided working for an anti-social rancher wasn't worth the trouble. Maybe I was making a fool of myself over nothing. But then I remembered the way she'd caught that coffee cup, the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent too much time cleaning up messes that weren't her fault. The Riverside apartments looked even worse up close than they did from the highway. Peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, and the kind of defeated atmosphere that settled over places where dreams came to die. I parked my truck next to a rusted-out Camaro and checked the slip of paper where I'd written down her address from her employment file. Apartment 2B, 2nd floor. The stairs were concrete, stained with years of neglect and whatever the Montana weather had thrown at them. Each step echoed in the enclosed stairwell, announcing my presence to anyone who cared to listen. I reached the 2nd floor and found 2B at the end of the hallway. Before I could knock, I heard voices from inside. Male voice, angry and slurred. Maria's voice, pleading. "Told you I don't have it yet, Danny. Mr. Thompson pays me Friday." "Friday's not good enough," the male voice exploded. Something crashed against the wall. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know you're holding out on me? I'm not, I swear, The sound that came next made my blood freeze. A sharp crack, like a hand meeting flesh, followed by Maria's cry of pain. I didn't think, didn't plan, didn't consider the consequences. My shoulder hit the door with 43 years of ranch work behind it. The cheap lock splintered like kindling, and I stumbled into a small living room that smelled of stale beer and fear. Maria was on the floor near the couch, one hand pressed to her cheek, her dark eyes wide with terror. Standing over her was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, wiry, with the kind of pale, hollow look that came from too many late nights and too many bad choices. He had stringy brown hair and tattoos crawling up both arms, and he was holding a beer bottle like a weapon. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled, spinning to face me. "Jake Thompson," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Maria's employer." The man, Danny apparently, looked me up and down, taking in my size, my work clothes, the way I was standing. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out if I was a threat or just another obstacle. "This is between me and my girlfriend," he said finally. "You need to get out." "I'm not his girlfriend," Maria said from the floor, her voice shaking. "I told you, Danny, we broke up months ago." "Shut up!" Danny whirled back toward her, raising the bottle. He never got the chance to bring it down. "I've thrown my share of hay bales over the years. Wrestled cattle, broken horses, done the kind of physical work that builds the kind of strength you don't get in a gym. When I moved across that small room, Danny didn't have time to react. My hand closed around his wrist, squeezing until I heard him gasp. The bottle fell to the floor and rolled under the coffee table. "You're leaving," I said, my voice still quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Right now, and you're not coming back." Danny tried to pull away, but I tightened my grip. "You don't know what you're getting into, old man. Maria owes me money. She owes me a lot more than money." "Not anymore." I walked him toward the broken door, his feet barely touching the ground. In the hallway, I stopped and looked him in the eyes. "Let me make something very clear," I said. "If I see you near Maria again, if I hear you've so much as called her, I will make you disappear. Do you understand me?" Something in my voice must have convinced him I wasn't bluffing. He nodded quickly, his face pale beneath the stubble. "Good." I released his wrist and gave him a gentle shove toward the stairs. "Now get out of here before I change my mind about letting you walk away." Danny stumbled down the hallway, cradling his wrist. At the top of the stairs, he turned back. "This isn't over," he called out, but his voice cracked on the words. "Yes," I said, "it is." I watched until he disappeared into the stairwell, then turned back to Maria's apartment. She was still sitting on the floor, but she'd pulled herself up against the couch. Tears were streaming down her face, and I could see a red mark blooming across her left cheek. "Are you hurt?" I asked. She shook her head, then immediately winced at the movement. "Just my face. It's not as bad as it looks." I knelt down beside her, careful to keep my movements slow and non-threatening. Up close, I could see other marks, older ones, fading yellow and green against her skin. "How long has this been going on?" "6 months, she whispered. "Since right before I started working for you. 6 months. The entire time she'd been cleaning my house, moving through my life like a quiet ghost, she'd been carrying this burden, and I'd been too wrapped up in my own isolation to see it." "Where are you watching this story from? I'd love to know which city you're joining me from as we follow what happens next." "We need to get you out of here," I said, helping Maria to her feet. "Pack whatever you need. You're coming back to the ranch with me." She pulled away, shaking her head frantically. "No, Mr. Thompson, you don't understand. Danny isn't just going to give up. He has friends, dangerous people. If I disappear with you, he'll come looking. He'll hurt you too." I looked around the small apartment, taking in the details I'd missed in the confrontation. The deadbolt on the door was new, but it had been useless against someone with a key. There were holes in the drywall that looked suspiciously like fist marks. The coffee table had one leg that had been crudely repaired with duct tape. This wasn't the first time Danny had been here. This wasn't the first time he'd gotten violent. "Tell me about the money," I said. Maria's shoulders sagged. She walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the parking lot below, probably checking to see if Danny's car was gone. "When we were together, he borrowed money from some people in Billings. Bad people. When I broke up with him, he told them I was responsible for the debt too." She turned back to me, her eyes hollow. $8,000. They want $8,000, and Danny says it's my job to pay it because I'm the one with steady work. $8,000. That was nearly 6 months of Maria's salary. Money she'd never see working 3 days a week cleaning houses. "So he's been taking your paychecks?" "Most of them. He leaves me just enough to pay rent and buy food." Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, like she was reading from a grocery list. "He says once the debt is paid, he'll leave me alone." I'd heard that story before. Men like Danny didn't let go of their victims. They just found new ways to justify their control. "Maria, listen to me. Men like Danny, they don't stop. Even if you pay off this debt, there'll be something else. There's always something else." She looked at me with the tired wisdom of someone who'd already figured that out. "I know, but what choice do I have? I can't go to the police. Danny's cousin works dispatch. I can't leave town. I don't have money, and my family is in Mexico. I can't fight him." She gestured to her small frame, then to the holes in the wall. "Look at me, Mr. Thompson. Look at what he can do." The helplessness in her voice hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about domestic violence. This was about systematic control, isolation, and a young woman who'd been stripped of every option except endurance. But she was wrong about one thing. "You're not alone anymore," I said. She stared at me. "Mr. Thompson, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. So I'm offering." I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. "I'm calling Sheriff Morrison right now. We're going to end this." "No!" Maria grabbed my wrist. "Please, you don't understand. The sheriff won't be able to do anything. Danny hasn't technically broken any laws. We live together, so he has a key. The debt is real, even if I didn't agree to it. And his cousin will make sure Danny knows we talked to police. She was right, and I knew it. Rural law enforcement was stretched thin, and domestic situations like this fell into legal gray areas that were hard to prosecute. Danny would get a warning, maybe spend a night in jail, then come back angrier than before. But I hadn't survived 43 years in Montana by backing down from problems just because they were complicated. Then we handle this differently, I said. Over the next hour, Maria told me the whole story. Danny Reeves, 28 years old, part-time mechanic and full-time lowlife. He'd charmed her when she first arrived in Montana 2 years ago, played the role of protector and provider until she was dependent on him. Then the mask had come off, revealing someone who saw Maria not as a partner, but as property. The borrowed money was real. Danny owed it to a crew that ran drugs and stolen goods between Billings and the Canadian border, but Maria had never seen a dime of it. Danny had used the money for a motorcycle he'd crashed 3 weeks later, drunk and showing off for his friends. He told them I was his business partner, Maria explained. Said we were starting a catering service together. Complete lie, but they have it in writing, his signature and mine. You signed something? He told me it was for a business loan. I trusted him. Her voice cracked on those last words. I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. Danny hadn't just been abusing Maria, he'd been systematically destroying her life, using her legal vulnerability as an undocumented worker against her. Maria, I need you to trust me now. Can you do that? She studied my face for a long moment. What are you going to do? I'm going to fix this. But I need you somewhere safe first. An hour later, we were back at the ranch. Maria sat at my kitchen table with a bag of frozen peas pressed to her cheek while I made phone calls. The first was to my lawyer in Great Falls, a sharp woman named Catherine Wells, who'd handled Sarah's estate and understood the value of decisive action. The second call was to my bank. 8,000? Catherine's voice crackled through the speakerphone. Jake, you don't even know this girl. I know enough, I said, watching Maria through the kitchen window. She was sitting on the porch, staring out at the mountains like she couldn't quite believe she was somewhere safe. And you want to pay off debt that isn't legally hers. I want to remove the excuse they're using to terrorize her. Catherine was quiet for a moment. What aren't you telling me, Jake? That was the question, wasn't it? What wasn't I telling myself? Maybe it was because Maria reminded me of Sarah when she was young. That same quiet strength, the same determination to take care of everyone else before herself. Maybe it was because I'd spent 3 years hiding from the world, and helping someone else felt like a way back to being human. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe some things were just right, regardless of the cost. If you've ever had to make a choice that could change everything, leave me a comment telling me which country you're listening from. Sometimes doing the right thing means risking everything we thought we wanted to protect. The meeting was set for Thursday night at Murphy's Bar. Neutral ground, Danny had insisted when I called him. He'd sounded surprised to hear from me, then suspicious. But the promise of $8,000 in cash had gotten his attention. I arrived early, choosing a table in the back corner where I could watch the room. Murphy's was the kind of place where conversations happened in low voices and nobody asked too many questions. Perfect for what I had planned. Danny showed up 20 minutes late, swagger in his step and 2 friends flanking him like bodyguards. I recognized the type. The kind of men who mistook cruelty for strength and thought intimidation was a substitute for intelligence. Thompson, Danny nodded as he slid into the booth across from me. His friends remained standing, trying to look menacing. You got the money? I placed a manila envelope on the table between us. 8,000 cash, but we need to talk terms. Danny's eyes fixed on the envelope like a hawk spotting prey. What terms? Money for debt. Simple transaction. Not quite. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice conversational. See, I did some research this week. Talked to some people. Turns out Maria's signature on that loan document. It's forged. The color drained from Danny's face. That's not... My lawyer had a handwriting expert examine it. Amazing what technology can do these days. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Turns out Maria never signed anything, which means this whole debt story is just extortion. One of Danny's friends stepped closer to the table. You calling Danny a liar? I'm calling Danny a criminal, I said calmly. Fraud, forgery, domestic violence, harassment. The list goes on. Danny's hands were shaking now, either from anger or fear. You can't prove any of that. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table. Actually, I can. See, Maria's been recording your conversations for the past month. Amazing what you can capture with a simple voice recorder app. This was a lie, but Danny didn't know that. I watched his face cycle through confusion, fear, and finally rage. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I pressed play on a recording I'd actually made earlier that day, Maria reading from a script I'd written, describing Danny's threats and demands. Her voice was shaky but clear. "He said if I don't bring him $500 by Friday, he'll make sure I can never work again. He knows people," he said. "People who can hurt me even if I try to run." Danny's friends exchanged glances. This was getting more complicated than they'd signed up for. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued, sliding the envelope across the table. "You're going to take this money and disappear permanently. You're going to tell your friends in Billings that the debt is settled and Maria is off limits. And if I ever see you near her again, if I hear you've so much as spoken her name, I'll take everything I have to the FBI." "The FBI?" Danny laughed, but it sounded forced. "For what? Interstate trafficking, extortion, racketeering. See, those friends of yours in Billings, they're already on federal radar. One phone call from me and suddenly you're not just a small-time thug anymore. You're a federal informant opportunity." This wasn't entirely a bluff. I'd spent the week making calls, leveraging old connections from my army days. It turned out the crew Danny owed money to was indeed under investigation by a joint task force. I couldn't deliver Danny to the FBI, but they didn't know that. Danny stared at the envelope, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. "And if I don't take your deal?" I leaned forward, dropping all pretense of friendliness. "Then Sheriff Morrison gets a very detailed report about what I found in Maria's apartment, including photos of her injuries and the recording. And testimony from the 3 witnesses who saw you threaten her in the grocery store parking lot last month. Another lie, but a believable one. Small towns had eyes everywhere, and everyone knew it." One of Danny's friends tugged at his sleeve. "Danny, maybe we should—" "Shut up." Danny's eyes never left mine. "You think you're real smart, don't you, old man? Coming in here with your money and your threats. I think I'm a man who's tired of watching bullies hurt people who can't fight back." The silence stretched between us, thick with tension. Around the bar, conversations continued in low murmurs, but our table felt like an island of potential violence. Finally, Danny reached for the envelope. "This is $8,000? Every penny." He opened it, rifled through the bills, then looked back at me with something like respect grudgingly growing in his eyes. "You know she's not even legal, right? She's not worth this much trouble." The rage that flared in my chest must have shown on my face, because Danny's friends both took a step back. "Get out," I said quietly. "Take the money and get out. Tonight. I want you gone from this county by morning." Danny stood slowly, tucking the envelope inside his jacket. "What about Maria? She just gets to walk away from everything? She gets to live her life without looking over her shoulder. That's all anyone deserves." He nodded once, then turned to leave. At the edge of our table, he stopped. "You know this won't end here, right? Guys like me, we don't just disappear." "No," I agreed, "but guys like me don't just forget." I watched them leave, then sat alone for another 20 minutes, nursing a beer I didn't want, and thinking about the conversation I'd have to have with Maria when I got home. The drive back to the ranch took me through familiar country under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than usual. When I pulled into my driveway, I could see light in the kitchen window and smoke rising from the chimney. Maria was waiting for me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes searching my face for answers. "Is it over?" she asked. I hung my coat on the back of a chair and sat across from her. "It's over." She started crying then, not the desperate tears of fear, but the overwhelming relief of someone who'd been holding their breath for months and could finally exhale. If you've ever lived through something that changed your life forever, tell me from which part of the world you're listening to this story. Sometimes the most important victories are the quiet ones that no one else ever hears about. 3 months later, Maria was still working at the ranch. Not just cleaning now, but helping with the books, managing appointments, gradually taking on the dozens of tasks that kept a working ranch running. She'd moved into the small apartment above the barn. Temporary, we'd both said, but neither of us seemed in any hurry to change the arrangement. Danny never came back. Word through the local gossip network was that he'd left Montana entirely, headed south with his tail between his legs. The investigation into his friends in Billings had indeed heated up, and several arrests were made. Though Danny's name never came up in the newspapers, Sheriff Morrison never did get that detailed report. Turns out he didn't need it. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't about grand gestures or heroic moments. Sometimes it's just about seeing someone who needs help and deciding that their safety matters more than your own comfort. Maria was family now, in the way that mattered most. Chosen family, forged not by blood but by the decision to show up for each other when it counted. And on quiet evenings when we sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, I could hear Sarah's voice in the wind, telling me she was proud.